Are we recording? I am assuming that we are. I'm Yoshi, also known as Jurassic Funatic here on YouTube, and this is my presentation on the purpose of scale in toy development. Now, yes, this is a very different video than other videos on my channel, but I am very much so into the toy industry, way past the idea of just collecting toys. So, if you're anything like me and you know a little bit about scale because you're an avid toy collector, and just are looking to learn some more information about it, cool. Or if you're brand new to this topic and this is the first time you're hearing of it, also, welcome to the presentation. I hope you learn a lot. Disclaimer, I do not currently work in the toy industry, but it is somewhere I would like to be in the future once I get my degree. All this information is simply acquired from being an avid toy collector and being just a little too obsessed with everything revolving around action figures. You feel me? All right, let's get started with the presentation. What will be covered in this presentation? Well, we will obviously discuss what scale is. That is kind of an important topic to discuss. We will talk about what is the point of scale. Why do we even need it at all? And we will talk about how to choose a scale. And to clarify the topic even more, I will show you some real life examples so that you completely get it. And hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you'll know exactly what you're talking about and feel very comfortable with the idea of scale. All right, so first off, what is scale? Scale, in terms of the toy development, is the ratio of measurement in which a figure stands in comparison to the actual thing. So, like any ratio, it's a number on top of another number. Okay, pretty simple. In the picture to the right, we have a 1/12 scale chart, which is also known as a 6-inch scale, compared to what the actual height of these people would be in real life. So if you look closely at those numbers, they are in feet and not inches. So this is a complete comparison of the action figure scale against what their in real life height would be. Now, if that's still confusing, that's completely understandable. We just got into this. We will go more in depth. So let's move on to the next slide. Here we have Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. This is his actual size. He is about 6 feet tall. Now, 6 feet tall seems to be the standard for what an action figure scale is based off of. So, if a character is shorter or taller than this 6 feet standard, they will obviously be slightly smaller or bigger in their action figure form. So, once again, toys are scale replicas of whoever they are representing. Here are two examples of action figures of Dr. Ian Malcolm here. We have a 7-inch and a 3 3/4 inch action figure of him. It is a replica of his real person, just in a smaller scale. How does this work? The ratio works like this. If you have a 1/10 scale action figure, also known as 7 inches, you should be able to stack 10 of them on top of each other, and it should be the same height as the reference you are basing it off of. Same goes for a 3 3/4 scaled action figure, but of course, you're going to need more of those to equal the actual height. So if you have a scale that is 1/8, you only need 8 figures stacked on top of each other to equal the same height as your reference. What happens if your reference does not have a real life counterpart? There's plenty of action figures that are based off of characters or things that don't actually exist. So, what do you do there? Because you don't really have any basis to work off of. Well, here we have Skeletor from Masters of the Universe, and he is said to be 6 feet, roughly 6 feet tall. So, what do? with an action figure? Well, in a 1/10th scale, you would do the exact same thing as if a hypothetical character of 6 feet were to be turned into an action figure. So, because Skeletor here is roughly 6 feet, even though he is not in existence in real life, you can treat it the same way that you would treat Dr. Ian Malcolm here. So, what is the point of scale? Why is this even a thing? How come we can't just make toys in whatever size we want for the heck of it? Well, believe it or not, kids and adults alike do not want their action figures to basically not work together. You can't have something be a 5.5 inch scale and something else be 7 inch, for instance, in this example here. It just doesn't work unless you want to have a giant interaction. That's usually not what we want. We want it to be the same scale. Also, another thing is when creating an environment around your toy line. So, toy lines are sometimes more than just the action figures. Sometimes they have vehicles, play sets, animal companions, accessories, whatever it is. And it doesn't make sense if your toy line is multiple different scales and you have to make those accessories for them. It's kind of stupid. It doesn't make sense and it's a waste of money. So, in the example here, we have Classics Castle Grayskull. This is made for figures in the 6 inch scale. And then here we have to the right of that Mondo He Man. He is an, I want to say, 18-inch scale or something. He's pretty big. Don't quote me on that. We have the vintage land shark made for 5.5 inch scale, and we have this little tiny Mega Constructs faker who is 2 inches. If this was all one toy line, it would not work. That is basically the point I am trying to show here. Okay. What different scales allow? So I broke up the common action figure scales into just 3 sections. I mean, you could break this up in however you want. Smaller scales. What are the pros of smaller scales? Well, they're cost effective. Smaller scale means less material to make your product, meaning cheaper to make in the long run. Also, world building elements. That means play sets, vehicles, animals are going to be easier to put in your toy line in a smaller scale because, like I said previously, smaller means less material. If you tried to do this with a bigger scale, it would be a lot more expensive. Another pro, fewer parts to assemble. Most smaller scales have less moving parts than medium and larger scale figures. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, but for the most part, there's less articulation when it comes to a smaller scale, meaning manufacturing and assembly is easier and cheaper. What are some of the cons of a smaller scale? Well, less detailed paint application. There's only so much detail you can put into something that is very tiny. There's fewer points of articulation, like I said previously. Of course, there's exceptions, but for the most part, smaller scales do not have a great amount of articulation. And also, more difficult to make super intricate sculpts. This is just challenging because you're working with a very small amount of material and you just simply will not be able to get the same amount of sculpt work you can get out of a larger scale. Moving on to the medium scale area, I did not know what else to call this other than that. The pros: world building elements are still possible. It's going to be more expensive to make, of course, because there's more material, but it is still a possibility. There's more room for articulation, more material, bigger size. You can fit more joints within your action figure. Also, more room for paint applications for the same reasons, and more room for a better sculpt for the same reasons. Some of the cons: slightly more expensive to make. Definitely going to be more expensive than a smaller scale. It's going to be a lot more expensive to make a playset in a medium scale than it is in a smaller scale. It's also sort of difficult to pair with other more popular scales. Now, this is just Kind of true, kind of not. I put it on there simply because these smaller and larger scales tend to be where most action figures sit. So if you're someone who puts different toy lines together and has characters that are in a scale that doesn't match the others, it could be problematic. So that one, I don't know. You could either take it off or leave it. Onto larger scales. Larger scales allow for an infinite amount of possibilities as to how much paint you want to put on your model. Of course, there's maximum amount of articulation points because bigger scale, more material to work with. Same with the easier to make intricate sculpts. This is where you're going to find your very accurate looking figures compared to their reference. Some cons: expensive to make and sell. Larger scale, more material, more articulation also means more parts to assemble. That is going to be more expensive to manufacture. Also, something I didn't talk about with the other scales, but is true for all: molding plastic for more material is, of course, going to be more expensive than less material. I think that is assumed. So, yes. All right, moving on. Some examples. This is a picture of the Mattel Jurassic World toy line, 3 and 3/4 inch scale. As you can see, Ian Malcolm there is the 6 foot reference. And depending on what the reference's size is in real life, will determine their height as an action figure. Most modern toy lines in this scale have around 10 points of articulation, but in the past, when this scale became a thing, so more like 4 inches is kind of how it was. It was usually five, it was very limited. Can you tell who these people are? The scale still allows for a pretty accurate representation of the reference. Medium scale. On the left, we have a Masters of the Universe Origins Buzz Off figure, and on the right, we have a vintage one. The modern one has 16 points of articulation. The vintage one has 6 points of articulation. This image kind of shows that you can fit a lot more articulation points into a scale of this size, but it really comes down to what the purpose of your toy line is. So in the 80s, 16 points of articulation was not really an advertisable thing like it is now. Larger scale, more detail. We have Triclops from the Masterverse line, and we have Triclops from the Masters of the Universe Origins line. Obviously, you have more room for more sculpt work, more paint, more articulation, etc. Whatever you want to say. How do you determine what scale you want to use for your toy line? Well, I came up with 3 categories. Target demographic. Who are your customers? Are they going to be adults? Are they going to be kids? Or are they going to be both? Appearance. How many points of articulation do you want your action figures to have? How much paint do you want them to have? And lastly, world building. Is your toy line primarily just focused on accurate human characters, or is it more of a world building toy line where there's going to be play sets, there's going to be vehicles, and they're all going to need to fit in a reasonable cost? A little more about target demographic. When you're designing a toy for a particular age group, it is important to take into consideration the scale of your figures. I also broke this up into 3 different categories. Kids 5 years and younger. You typically see a larger scale with fewer parts, meaning less articulation. Now, of course, there are some figures that are made for younger kids that are smaller than a larger scale. For instance, this Imaginext Batman can either be that really small 2 inch, 2.75 inch. I'm not really sure. Or it can be this XL sized Batman figure. Either way, minimal, minimal parts, minimal paint. It gets the job done. Kids 5 years old and older. Smaller scales become more of an option, as well as more parts. Kids of this age will, of course, probably want a more accurate representation of their favorite characters, as well as the abilities to move them in more ways than someone younger than them who really probably doesn't care. Lastly, adult collectors, all scales are available. Do what you want. You can make them incredibly screen accurate, or you can make them not. It's really up to what your customers want from your toy line. Appearance. Making toys costs a lot of money, so it is important to think where you want to invest that money into. At mass retail, we unfortunately cannot put money into every single aspect of a toy that we want. So we can't go throwing money at paint, sculpt, size, accessories. We got to kind of pick and choose. So for kids 5 years and younger, there's typically very minimal paint applications. There's also very low articulation for the most part. Most of these toys that you will find for kids 5 years and younger are simply molded plastic. There's very, very, very few paint applications. If you take a look at these, the colors are blocks of plastic that's molded in that color opposed to printed on or painted details. Kids 5 years old and older, there's slightly more detailed sculpt, makes the character look a little more accurate to what they should look like, which these kids would prefer. And there is a little more paint applications, still being cautious on how much they put in terms of how much they want to end up selling it for. And this scale definitely tends to have a lot of action features simply because at this age group, playability is an important thing to consider. And lastly, adult collectors. Appearance is the primary thing that matters. They usually like the screen accurate looking figures. They want as much articulation as possible to be able to put them in the poses that they want and display them. Lastly, world building. Like previously stated, toys cost a lot of money, roughly $100,000 per figure, because you have to buy the tool, which is a lot of money. So, you need to decide whether your toy line is going to be based on accessories, vehicles, playsets, or if your toy line is mainly just action figure based. Kids 5 years and younger, lots of environment, lots of things to interact with. This is important. You don't want just action figures for this demographic. It's probably not going to work very well. All right, kids 5 years old and older. They'll benefit from the same idea of having an environment. So you can do play sets, you can do vehicles. They'll they'll also want that probably with a little more detail and not as simplified. But I did mention here that unfortunately kids at this age kind of grow out of toys now, which kind of sucks. Very unfortunate. So creating a toy line for this age group might be a little more difficult than it was 10 years ago. And finally, adult collectors. These toy lines typically do not have much environment around them and are simply highly articulated and nice looking figures that are based off of their actual real life counterpart. Now, that's not to say that these toy lines don't have playsets and don't have vehicles, because they do, but it's few and far between, and you're not really going to see that in mass retail. Now, some real toy line examples. We've discussed what scale is, we've discussed how it works, and we've discussed how to choose and go about which scale you would want to use. So let's look at some examples of a few different scales that are in modern toy lines right now and what their purpose serves. All right. So this is, of course, the Mattel Jurassic World 3 and 3/4 main line for their dinosaur figures and whatnot. If you're watching this channel, you obviously know that there's a bit of this on this channel. Okay, here are some pictures of this toy line. We have humans, dinosaurs, animals, vehicles, and there are playsets I just did not show here. Our target demographic is primarily kids ages 5 and above. Typically, if you're not an adult collector, it would probably be like ages 5 to 8, I'd say, with modern time. Appearance, minimal paint applications, about 3 to 5 color palettes per figure. And what I mean by that is if you take a look at each printed part on a figure in this toy line, there will only be so much variety in color. Often you hear adult collectors complaining about why something's inaccurate. Like, why is this eye color inaccurate? Or why is this marking not correct? It usually comes down to cutting costs and using a color that can serve the most purpose while keeping whatever you're making looking fairly accurate. So, as much as they would want to add that sixth color, let's say, to make it 100% accurate, it's cheaper to use a color that does more work along the entire figure than it is to select one color for only one thing. That's typically the reason why things are not 100% accurate, especially in mass retail toy lines. World building, dinosaurs, vehicles, and playsets, like I said before. This is what this toy line kind of thrives on, and it's definitely not just a human action figure line. So, why did they choose a 1/18th scale or 3 3/4? Well, the biggest reason is world building. Like I said, this is not a toy line where it's just human figures. This is a toy line where they need to make dinosaurs in scale with these people. If they made a toy line that was in a bigger scale, it'd be a lot more expensive and they wouldn't have as much freedom in terms of playsets and vehicles and dinosaurs they can make. If they choose a small toy line, the humans are just big enough to where they represent who they're supposed to represent fairly, as well as being able to have a variety of dinosaurs of different sizes still compatible with those people while all being in the same scale. Moving on. We have another toy line from Mattel. If you can't tell, I really like Mattel, so that's why we're sticking with this, okay? I only talk about things that I know about, so like if I'm not talking about your favorite toy lines, that's why I don't need to butcher it, okay? We've got Mattel, Masters of the Universe, Masterverse, 7-inch toy line. Here are some pictures. Okay. Our target demographic is adult collectors. That's not to say kids can't buy this. It simply means that toy manufacturers and toy creators are specifically making these for what adult collectors want, if that makes any sense. The appearance, highly articulated with more than a few paint apps. So, because we are at a bigger scale and it's more about the appearance, we can put more money into how it looks. That means we can have more paint applications, more different colors being printed and painted on, as well as more moving parts. World building, mainly just humanoid characters. So far, there's Battle Cat. That isn't a humanoid. Technically, not all of them are humans. So, because of that, they chose a 1/10th scale. The biggest reason is because the appearance is the most important factor that plays into this toy line. They don't need to worry about playsets or vehicles, at least now. I don't see any of them coming. So they can put their money towards the way a figure is sculpted, how many points of articulation there is, and also paint applications. Lastly, we have the vintage Masters of the Universe line, which is a 5.5-inch toy line. Here are some pictures. Alrighty. Our target demographic is kids 3 and up, or it would probably be more like in that time 3 to 10 years old, maybe. Appearance, minimal paint applications, and minimal articulation. If you notice, with just a few pictures that I have, or any other Masters of the Universe figures you've seen, a lot of them have very little paint application. In fact, sculpted details on them are not even painted half the time. This is usually because of the demographic, because kids honestly don't care, and very minimal articulation because kids honestly don't care. World building. This is a toy line that is heavy on vehicles, animals, and play sets. There's a lot of play sets in the vintage Masters of the Universe line, something that we don't see often anymore today, mainly because kids are growing out of toys, which sucks. But in the 80s, play sets were definitely a thing. vehicles were definitely a thing. This was a toy line that had to work with more than just simply human action figures. So, why the 1/12 scale? Why not do 3 3/4 like the Jurassic World toy line, which also is heavy on playsets and vehicles? Biggest reason? Demographic and world building, but mainly demographic. Smaller parts are not favorable if you're making toys for younger kids. That also means we need minimal parts because the more parts, the more chance there is for it to break. So, honestly, the main priority is the toy needs to be durable and it needs to do the thing. Okay. So, this is a good happy medium where it's not a super large scale to where playsets and vehicles become not affordable to the average customer, but it's also not too small to where there's too much small parts to where it's not suitable for kids of the demographic that they are aiming towards. It is a good in between to where things are big, but not too big, if you get what I'm saying. All right, the presentation is basically over. Wow, that was a lot. A review. What is scale? Well, scale is the measurement that is used to make action figures based off of their real life counterparts or their fake real life counterparts. You get what I mean. And how does it work? Well, it works by coming up with how a size of an action figure relates to that reference. So, like I showed in the slide, 1/10 scale, there's going to be 10 action figures needed to make up that actual height. Why does it matter? Well, one, cost efficient. Two, your audience doesn't want a toy line that has a million different scales. It's confusing. It's weird. It makes no sense. So, yes, you want to keep things simple and make things one scale, okay? And how do you decide a scale? Well, look at your target demographic, look at what you want your action figures to look like, and look at whether or not your toy line is going to be based solely on action figures or if there's going to be more of an environment surrounding them. Weird. Lastly, we took a look at some examples of modern and not modern lines that show each main priority of target demographic, appearance, and world building. So I hope you learned something from this presentation, and I hope I did a decent job presenting it because this is the first time that I have done a video presentation on my channel. So I hope this was good, and let me know if you like content like this and what other things you would want me to cover because I definitely have more ideas of things that I want to share with you guys. So if you enjoyed it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I am Jurassic Fanatic, and this was my presentation on action figure scales.